In the annals of human history, few rulers have left a legacy as tainted by depravity as Tiberius Caesar Augustus, the second emperor of Rome. What began as the reign of a disciplined military commander descended into a nightmare of perversion that would shock even the most debauched of his contemporaries. The stories that emerged from his self-imposed exile on the island of Capri paint a portrait so disturbing that historians still debate whether they could be true. Yet the consistency of ancient accounts, particularly those of Suetonius and Tacitus, suggests that behind the marble facades of imperial power lurked a darkness that defies comprehension. Tonight we plunge into the abyss of one man's corruption, where absolute power not only corrupted absolutely, but created a monster whose appetites knew no bounds. When Tiberius donned the imperial purple in 14 AD, Rome breathed a sigh of relief. Here was a man of proven military skill, a general who had secured the empire's northern borders and demonstrated administrative competence. The adopted son of Augustus seemed the perfect choice to continue the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But beneath the surface of this austere, somewhat reluctant emperor, dark currents were already flowing. His early years were marked by personal tragedies. The death of his beloved brother Drusus, a forced divorce from his first wife Vipsania, and a loveless political marriage to Julia, the notoriously promiscuous daughter of Augustus. These wounds festered in Tiberius's soul, creating fissures that would eventually rupture. The transformation did not happen overnight. During the first decade of his reign, Tiberius governed with reasonable competence, maintaining Augustus's policies and preserving the empire's stability. He was frugal with public funds, avoided unnecessary wars, and initially showed respect for the Senate's authority. But those who knew him personally detected a growing bitterness, a cynicism that deepened with each passing year. The death of his son Drusus in 23 AD, possibly by poisoning, marked a turning point. Grief-stricken and increasingly paranoid, Tiberius began to withdraw from public life. The man who had once led legions through Germania now seemed to recoil from the very people he ruled. It was in 26 AD that Tiberius made the decision that would forever tarnish his name. Leaving Rome behind, he retreated to the island of Capri off the coast of Naples. Officially, he sought relief from the pressures of governance. In reality, he was building a private kingdom where his darkest fantasies could run free. The island, with its dramatic cliffs and isolated location, became the perfect stage for horrors that would make even the most hardened Romans blanch. 12 villas were constructed on Capri, each a monument to excess, and each hiding secrets that servants whispered of in terror. The Senate continued to function in Rome, but true power now emanated from this island fortress. Tiberius ruled through fear and correspondence. His letters carried death sentences, and his silence often proved equally fatal. Those who visited Capri returned with haunted eyes if they returned at all. The emperor surrounded himself with astrologers, particularly the sinister Thrasyllus, who fed his paranoia with predictions of betrayal. Every senator became a potential enemy, every whispered conversation a possible conspiracy. The empire was now governed by a recluse whose primary communications with the outside world were execution orders. What truly set Tiberius apart from other tyrannical rulers was not just his cruelty, it was the perverted creativity with which he pursued his pleasures. Ancient sources describe scenes that pushed the boundaries of human depravity. The emperor's sexual appetites had morphed into something monstrous, focusing particularly on the innocent and defenseless. Children, both boys and girls, were brought to Capri under various pretexts, never to leave the same. Some were trained as little fish, a term that still makes historians uneasy. Taught to swim between the emperor's legs in his pool, nipping and caressing him in grotesque aquatic games. The poolside activities were only the beginning. Suetonius, writing decades later, but with access to imperial archives and eyewitness accounts, describes elaborate theatrical performances of a sexual nature. Young people were forced to engage in sexual acts while Tiberius watched, often in groups of 3, which he called chains. The emperor collected erotic art and literature from across the empire, particularly from the east, using them as instruction manuals for new forms of debauchery. His chambers were decorated with the most explicit imagery, creating an atmosphere of constant sexual stimulation. Even hardened courtiers were shocked by the emperor's innovations in perversion. Perhaps the most disturbing were the spintrii, young sex slaves specially trained in specific acts. These children, taken from their families or sold by desperate parents, were educated solely in the arts of pleasure. They lived in the villas of Capri, their existence entirely devoted to satisfying the emperor's increasingly bizarre demands. Some were taught to perform acts so specific and unusual that Latin lacked words to describe them. The term spintriae itself became so associated with unspeakable acts that it was rarely used in polite Roman society thereafter. These children had no future beyond Tiberius's pleasure. Many did not survive his service, and those who did were often killed to ensure their silence. The corruption spread beyond Tiberius himself. To sustain his lifestyle, the emperor needed accomplices, and he found them among the ambitious and equally depraved. Young nobles seeking favor offered their own siblings or children to the emperor. Others became procurers, scouring the empire for new victims to feed Tiberius's appetites. An entire economy of exploitation developed around the imperial court, with human flesh as currency. Officers who showed reluctance or moral scruples were accused of treason, their property confiscated, and their families destroyed. In this way, Tiberius created a system where participation in his perversions became a mechanism of survival. The stories emerging from Capri grew more horrific with each retelling. There were tales of infants still nursing being sexually abused, of noble virgins forced to surrender their innocence in perverted religious ceremonies for the emperor's pleasure. One particularly chilling account describes how Tiberius had young victims thrown from Capri's cliffs after he was done with them, with soldiers stationed below to ensure none survived the fall. Whether every detail is accurate matters less than the fact that Romans believed their emperor capable of such acts. The very existence of these stories speaks to the terror Tiberius inspired. Beyond sexual depravity, there was a broader sadism that permeated every aspect of Tiberius's rule. The emperor delighted in psychological torture, often granting reprieves to condemned prisoners, only to execute them days later. He forced parents to watch their children's executions, or worse, to participate in them. One senator was compelled to continue attending dinners and public functions immediately after his son's death, forced to smile and converse, while grief tore at his heart. Tiberius justified these cruelties as tests of loyalty, but in truth he simply enjoyed watching people suffer. The line between governance and sadism had vanished entirely. Treason trials became Tiberius's primary tool of terror. Any word gesture or even facial expression could be interpreted as criticism of the emperor. Professional informants known as delatores proliferated across the empire, growing rich on the estates of those they condemned. The accusation itself became a death sentence, as Tiberius rarely acquitted anyone brought before him. Torture was employed liberally to extract confessions, with methods growing ever more creative and brutal. The emperor personally devised new torments, including one where victims were forced to drink vast quantities of wine before having their genitals tied with ropes, causing excruciating pain as their bladders filled. The Senate, once the proud governing body of the Republic, was reduced to a collection of terrified sycophants. Senators competed in proposing honors for Tiberius, each trying to outdo the others in subservience. They voted for the execution of their own colleagues on the flimsiest evidence, knowing that showing mercy could mark them as the next victims. The great deliberative body that once stood against Hannibal now cowered before the madness of a single man. Some senators committed suicide rather than face trial, knowing that at least this way their families might retain some property and dignity. Even natural death offered no escape from Tiberius's vengeance. The emperor prosecuted the dead, confiscating their estates and destroying their memorials. Children were executed for mourning their parents too ostentatiously. The law was twisted into a weapon of pure oppression, with ancient statutes resurrected and reinterpreted to serve the emperor's paranoia. The charge of maestas, injury to the majesty of the Roman people, became so broad that virtually any action could be framed under it. Men were executed for carrying coins bearing Tiberius's image into latrines or brothels, for criticizing a poem he had written in his youth, even for consulting soothsayers about the emperor's health. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound. Trust evaporated as friends and family became potential informants. Dinner conversations died, replaced by nervous silences. Writers destroyed their works rather than risk accusations of subversion. The vibrant intellectual life that had flourished under Augustus withered in the toxic atmosphere of fear. Parents warned their children to guard their tongues even while sleeping, lest they murmur something that could be reported. The very fabric of Roman social life, built on discussion and debate, unraveled under the weight of terror. Meanwhile, on Capri, Tiberius descended further into madness. His appearance, never particularly attractive, had become grotesque. Ancient sources describe his face covered in pustules and sores, partly from disease and partly from the various ointments and treatments he used. He wore wigs to cover his baldness and heavy makeup to hide his ravaged features. The once proud general now resembled a sickly satyr lurking in his island lair. His paranoia reached such heights that he tested his food on condemned prisoners before eating and slept surrounded by guards, even in his most private chambers. The administration of the empire fell increasingly to Sejanus, the ambitious Praetorian prefect, who had helped enable Tiberius's worst excesses. For years, Sejanus wielded near-absolute power in Rome, while Tiberius remained on Capri. But even this relationship was poisoned by the emperor's nature. In 31 AD, Tiberius suddenly turned on his chief minister, orchestrating Sejanus's downfall and execution with the same creative cruelty he applied to all his victims. The purge that followed claimed hundreds of lives as anyone associated with Sejanus faced death. Children were executed alongside their parents, though Roman law traditionally protected minors. In one particularly horrific case, a young girl was raped by the executioner before her death because virgins could not legally be executed. The final years of Tiberius's reign saw his madness reach its peak. Now in his 70s, the emperor's physical desires may have waned, but his cruelty only intensified. He began to fear death, obsessively consulting astrologers daily and executing those who predicted his demise. Yet he also seemed to court death, taking unnecessary risks and ignoring his health. The man who had hidden on Capri for over a decade suddenly made brief, terrifying forays to the mainland, leaving devastation in his wake. These journeys resembled the advance of a plague more than imperial visits, as communities scrambled to hide their young and beautiful from the emperor's predatory gaze. Ancient writers competed in describing the depths of Tiberius's depravity. And while some details may be exaggerated, the overall picture remains consistent. Tacitus, generally considered the most reliable historian of the period, wrote, with barely concealed disgust, about scenes he could scarcely bring himself to describe, even accounting for the political bias and tendency of Roman historians to vilify bad emperors. The sheer volume and consistency of the accounts suggest a reign of true horror. The fact that many of these stories were recorded by historians writing under subsequent emperors who had no reason to defend Tiberius adds credibility to them. The question that haunts historians is how a man who began as a competent general and administrator could transform into such a monster. Some point to the corrupting influence of absolute power, arguing that Tiberius simply represents an extreme example of Lord Acton's famous dictum. Others see in his descent evidence of mental illness, possibly exacerbated by alcohol and the stresses of governance. The personal tragedies of his early life, the forced divorce, the unhappy marriage, the death of his son certainly played a role in twisting his psyche. But perhaps the most terrifying possibility is that the monster was always there, waiting for the opportunity to emerge. Modern psychological analysis might diagnose Tiberius with a cocktail of disorders: sadistic personality disorder, paranoid schizophrenia, sexual sadism disorder. But such clinical terms fail to capture the full horror of what he became. This was a man who had the power to indulge every dark impulse without consequence, and he used that power to the fullest. In Tiberius, we see what happens when the restraints of civilization are removed from someone already inclined toward cruelty. The result is a cautionary tale that resonates through history. The Roman people themselves seem to sense the evil emanating from Capri. Stories and rumors spread across the empire, growing more horrific with each retelling. Parents used Tiberius as a bogeyman to scare children into obedience. Graffiti appeared on walls cursing his name, though the authors risked death if discovered. Even among the elite who benefited from the imperial system, there was a growing sense that something fundamental had broken in Rome. The empire continued to function. Taxes were collected, borders, defended trade conducted, but a moral rot had set in at its core. The religious implications added another layer to the horror. Romans took their gods seriously, and many believed Tiberius's perversions had angered the divine powers. Natural disasters during his reign, earthquakes, floods, fires, were interpreted as signs of divine wrath. The corruption of religious ceremonies for his sexual gratification was seen as particularly blasphemous. Some of the mystery cults that had flourished under Augustus went underground, rather than risk being perverted for imperial pleasure. Rome's very spiritual life was being poisoned by its ruler. The economic impact of Tiberius's reign of terror often goes unnoticed but was substantial. The constant confiscations enriched the imperial treasury but destroyed the entrepreneurial spirit that had helped build Roman prosperity. Wealthy families hid their assets or spent them quickly rather than risk drawing attention. Investment dried up as no one wanted to appear too successful. The delators created a parasitic economy based on destruction, not production. Even on Capri, the cost of maintaining the emperor's pleasures, the villas, the guards, the constant stream of victims drained resources that could have been used productively elsewhere. International relations also suffered under the paranoid emperor. Foreign ambassadors were kept waiting for years, unsure whether approaching Capri would result in success or death. Allied kings saw their children held as guests in Rome, effectively hostages to ensure compliance. The Parthians, Rome's great eastern rivals, watched with astonishment as the empire turned inward, consuming itself with purges and perversions. Some frontier territories began to drift from Roman control, their governors too focused on survival to maintain proper administration. The iron discipline that had built the empire was eroding from within. Art and literature from Tiberius's reign reflect the darkness of the times. The great poets fell silent or turned to safe mythological themes. Historians confined themselves to ancient history rather than risk commenting on current events. The visual arts became either grossly pornographic, catering to imperial tastes, or blandly conventional, avoiding any possibility of offense. The creative flourishing that had marked Augustus's reign withered in the poisonous atmosphere. Even architecture reflected the shift. While Augustus had built temples and public works, Tiberius built only his pleasure palaces on Capri and torture chambers in Rome. The role of women in Tiberius's reign presents a particularly tragic chapter. Beyond the countless female victims of his sexual predations, women of the noble class found themselves in impossible positions. Mothers were forced to offer their daughters to the emperor or face destruction. Wives of condemned men were often executed or enslaved, their children scattered. The few powerful women who survived, like Antonia Minor, did so through extreme caution and likely considerable compromise. The traditional Roman respect for matrons and the sanctity of marriage became meaningless in the face of imperial lust. Medicine and science, which had advanced considerably in the early empire, stagnated under Tiberius. Physicians were more concerned with creating aphrodisiacs and treatments for the emperor's various ailments than advancing medical knowledge. The emperor's obsession with astrology gave precedence to that pseudoscience over genuine astronomical observation. Natural philosophers avoided any research that might be interpreted as prying too closely into nature's secrets. Such curiosity could be fatal. The rational inquiry the Greeks had brought to Rome retreated in the face of superstition and fear. The army, long Rome's proudest institution, was not immune to corruption. Officers were promoted based on their willingness to procure victims for the emperor or inform on their colleagues. The Praetorian Guard, originally created to protect the emperor, became an instrument of terror against Rome's own citizens. Soldiers who once dreamed of glory on the frontiers found themselves assigned to throw children off cliffs or torture senators. The legions on the borders remained effective through inertia and tradition, but the martial spirit that had conquered the Mediterranean was fading. Even the concept of Roman justice, once a source of pride across the empire, became a mockery. Laws were interpreted solely to serve the emperor's will. Precedents meant nothing if they conflicted with Tiberius's desires. Lawyers who defended the accused too vigorously found themselves under accusation. Judges competed to declare defendants guilty, knowing that an acquittal might be seen as defiance of the emperor's will. The great legal principles that would later influence all Western law were perverted into tools of oppression. As Tiberius aged, his fear of assassination grew to maniacal proportions. He had tasters for his food tasters, guards watching guards. The astrologer Thrasyllus remained constantly at his side, reading omens, in everything from bird flights to cloud formations. Yet ironically, the emperor's actual death would not come from conspiracy, but from natural causes, or perhaps, as some whispered, with the gentle assistance of his successor. The man who had lived in such fear of death for so long finally faced it alone, abandoned even by his perversions. The immediate aftermath of Tiberius's death on March the 16th, 37 AD, revealed the depth of hatred he had inspired. When the news reached Rome, the people erupted in celebration. To the Tiber with Tiberius, they shouted demanding his body be thrown into the river like a common criminal. The Senate, freed from terror, initially refused to deify him, as they had Augustus. Only the intervention of his successor Caligula ensured Tiberius received the funeral rites due an emperor. But even these were perfunctory, lacking the genuine mourning that had marked Augustus's death. The historical debate over Tiberius continues to this day. Some revisionist historians argue that the ancient sources exaggerated his crimes, that Tacitus and Suetonius were biased by their own political agendas. They point to the continued stability and prosperity of the empire during his reign as evidence that the administrative apparatus functioned well despite the emperor's personal failings. These arguments have some merit. The empire did indeed continue to function, and some of the more extreme stories may indeed be exaggerations. But the sheer volume of testimony, the consistency of the accounts, and the genuine terror reflected in contemporary documents suggest that even if some details were embellished, the essential horror was real. The psychological impact of Tiberius's reign extended far beyond his death. Romans learned that their emperor could be a monster. That knowledge poisoned the relationship between ruler and ruled for generations. Future emperors would be viewed with suspicion, their every act scrutinized for signs of Tiberian tendencies. The Senate never recovered its dignity or independence, having been thoroughly broken. The precedents set during those dark years, the use of treason trials, the employment of informants, the conflation of private vice with public policy, would be revived by subsequent bad emperors. For Tiberius's victims, there was no posthumous justice. The children abused on Capri, the senators tortured in Rome, the families destroyed by false accusations. Their suffering went unrecorded, except as statistics in the chronicles of tyranny. We know thousands died during the Reign of Terror, but each number represents a human being whose life was cut short by imperial madness. The Spantrii simply vanished from history, their fate unknown but easily imagined. The moral wound inflicted on Roman society took generations to heal, if it ever fully did. The physical legacy of Tiberius's reign proved equally tainted. The villas on Capri stood empty for years, shunned as cursed places. Later emperors occasionally visited the island, but never stayed long, as if the very stones retained some contamination from what had happened there. The torture chambers in Rome were eventually dismantled, but their sites remained infamous. Archaeological excavations on Capri have found evidence of the extensive building projects, but mercifully no direct confirmation of the horrors described in ancient sources. Perhaps some secrets are better left buried. Modern dictators have often been compared to Tiberius, though few have matched his combination of political power and personal depravity. The 20th century produced its share of monsters, but they generally focused on political terror rather than sexual predation, or kept their personal vices separate from their public crimes. Tiberius remains almost unique in history for the way he fused governance with perversion, making the satisfaction of his warped desires an actual function of the state. In this sense, he represents a singular warning about the depths to which human nature can sink when all restraints are removed. The question of why the Romans tolerated such a monster for 23 years has no easy answer. Fear certainly played the primary role. The terror was real and resistance meant death. But there was also the issue of precedent. The Romans had accepted the Principate under Augustus because it brought peace and prosperity after decades of civil war. Once they traded freedom for security, it became difficult to reverse course. The Senate had willingly surrendered much of its power. Reclaiming it would require a courage that terror had crushed. Individual acts of resistance occurred, but they never coalesced into organized opposition. Cultural factors also played a role in enabling Tiberius's successes. Roman society, despite its civilized veneer, always contained elements of brutality, gladiatorial games, slavery, the exposure of unwanted infants. All were accepted parts of Roman life. The emperor's perversions were extreme even by Roman standards, but they existed on a continuum with accepted practices rather than representing something wholly alien. This made it easier for people to rationalize or ignore what was happening, telling themselves it was just an extreme version of normal Roman behavior. The role of enablers deserves particular condemnation. Tiberius could not have sustained his reign of terror alone. He needed procurers to find victims' guards to enforce his will, informants to feed his paranoia, and courtiers to normalize his behavior. Each of these individuals made a choice to participate in evil for personal gain. Some no doubt told themselves they had no choice, that refusal meant death, but others actively profited from the system-building careers on the suffering of innocence. These secondary monsters often escaped punishment after Tiberius's death, reintegrating into society with their ill-gotten gains. The international ramifications of Tiberius's reign extended beyond Rome's borders. Allied kingdoms watched in horror as the leader of the civilized world descended into depravity. Some barbarian tribes, previously intimidated by Rome's power and civilization, began to question whether the empire represented a superior culture or merely organized brutality. The moral authority Rome claimed as the bearer of law and order to the world was severely undermined. Future Roman expansion would face greater resistance from peoples who had heard the stories of Capri and wondered what kind of civilization they were being invited to join. Religious and philosophical movements that emerged or grew during this period often reflected a search for meaning in the face of such evil. Stoicism, with its emphasis on inner virtue, regardless of external circumstances, offered comfort to those living under tyranny. Eastern mystery religions promising salvation in the afterlife attracted followers who had lost hope for justice in this world. The ground was being prepared for new spiritual movements that would eventually challenge the entire basis of Roman society. In a sense, Tiberius's evil helped create the conditions for Rome's eventual spiritual transformation. The literary legacy of Tiberius's reign is found not in what was written, but in what was not. The silence of contemporary writers speaks volumes about the climate of fear. When historians finally felt safe to record events, decades had passed, and they relied on whispered stories, secret memories, and official records that survived the purges. This gap in contemporary documentation means we will never know the full extent of what occurred. How many victims vanished without record? How many stories were too horrific even for ancient historians to repeat? The silence itself becomes a form of testimony. For modern readers, Tiberius's story serves as more than just a historical horror tale. It demonstrates how quickly a civilized society can descend into barbarism when checks on power are removed. It shows how fear can paralyze decent people into inaction. It reveals how evil systems perpetuate themselves by corrupting everyone they touch. Most disturbingly, it suggests that the capacity for such evil does not exist in some separate category of inhuman monsters, but within human nature itself, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Tiberius's death brought immediate relief, but no real resolution. His successor, Caligula, would prove that imperial madness was not unique to one man. The structural problems that allowed Tiberius to turn the Principate into a terror state remained unchanged. Rome had created a system where the character of one man determined the fate of millions, and that system would continue to produce monsters alongside the occasional good emperor. The best that can be said is that future tyrants rarely matched Tiberius's particular combination of administrative competence and personal depravity. Archaeological evidence provides frustratingly little confirmation or refutation of the ancient accounts. The villas on Capri have yielded artworks and architecture consistent with luxury and excess, but nothing that definitively proves the specific horrors described. This absence of physical evidence has allowed some to argue that the stories were exaggerated. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And it's worth noting that Tiberius would have had both the means and the motive to ensure physical evidence of his worst crimes was destroyed. The victims thrown from cliffs left no archaeological trace. The medical and psychological aspects of Tiberius's behavior continue to fascinate researchers. Some have suggested his facial disfigurement and skin conditions might have resulted from sexually transmitted diseases, creating a vicious cycle where physical decay fueled psychological deterioration. Others point to possible lead poisoning from Roman water pipes and wine vessels, which could have contributed to mental instability. But while these factors may have exacerbated his condition, they cannot excuse or fully explain the deliberate cruelty and systematic perversion that characterized his reign. Economic historians note an interesting paradox. Despite the terror and corruption, the Roman economy remained relatively stable during Tiberius's reign. Trade continued, taxes were collected efficiently, and infrastructure was maintained. This disconnect between political horror and economic continuity suggests how large, complex systems can continue functioning even under monstrous leadership. It also raises uncomfortable questions about complicity. How many merchants, tax collectors, and administrators simply went about their daily work while horrors unfolded around them? The gender dynamics of Tiberius's crimes deserve special attention. While he victimized both men and women, the particular vulnerability of women and children in Roman society made them especially easy targets. The legal system offered them little protection, and social norms that might have provided some shield were meaningless to an emperor above all law. The stories of mothers forced to watch their children's abuse of virgin priestesses, violated of noblewomen reduced to sexual slavery, represent a particular thread of horror running through all accounts of the reign. Comparative analysis with other historical periods of state terror reveals both similarities and unique aspects of Tiberius's reign. The use of informants, show trials, and arbitrary execution appears in many tyrannical regimes, but the fusion of political oppression with personal sexual predation on such a scale remains relatively rare. Most dictators maintain some separation between their public and private crimes. Tiberius's innovation was to make his private perversions a matter of state policy, using the full apparatus of imperial power to satisfy personal desires. The psychological profiles of those who thrived under Tiberius make for disturbing reading. The successful courtiers, the informants who rose, the procurers who gained wealth and status. What kind of people were these historical sources? Provide some names and details, revealing individuals who combined intelligence with utter moral vacuity. They understood the system and manipulated it brilliantly, building careers on the suffering of others. These secondary monsters often survived their master, carrying their toxic skills into subsequent reigns. For legal scholars, Tiberius's reign marks a pivotal point in the development of Western law. The perversion of legal procedure for tyrannical ends demonstrated the need for structural protections against arbitrary power. Later Roman jurists would develop principles aimed at preventing such abuses, though with limited success under the imperial system. The concept that the law must bind even rulers, that procedure matters as much as outcome, that justice requires more than the sovereign's will. All these ideas were sharpened by Tiberius's negative example. The final assessment of Tiberius must acknowledge the banality of evil alongside its horror. Amid the atrocities, the empire went about its daily business. Merchants traded, farmers planted, soldiers trained. This normality coexisting with the nightmare creates its own form of horror. It shows how human societies can accommodate almost anything, how ordinary life continues even in the shadow of monstrosity. The victims on Capri could probably hear fishermen singing as they worked, oblivious or indifferent to the screams from the villas above. As we conclude this examination of one of humanity's darkest chapters, we are left with questions that transcend historical details. How does a human become capable of such evil? What systems enable and amplify individual depravity? Why do good people fail to resist? These questions matter not just as historical curiosities, but as warnings. Tiberius is dead, but the conditions that created him, the concentration of power, the collapse of accountability, the normalization of cruelty, can emerge in any era. The island of Capri remains one of Italy's most beautiful tourist destinations today. Visitors admire the same views Tiberius saw, walk paths he might have trodden. Few think about what happened here. Perhaps that's natural. Life moves on. History fades, beauty endures, but forgetting carries dangers. Every spectacular sunset over the Mediterranean also sets over sites of unimaginable suffering. In the contradiction between natural beauty and human evil, we find a fundamental truth about our species' capacity for both transcendence and depravity. Tiberius died on March 16, 37 AD at the age of 77. Some say he was smothered by Macro, the new Praetorian prefect. Others claim he died naturally alone. What matters is that he died unrepentant, still planning executions from his deathbed. His final words, according to some sources, were about his suspicions of those around him. He died as he lived, paranoid, cruel, and wholly consumed by the evil he chose to embody. The man who inherited the greatest empire in the world left it morally poisoned, politically traumatized, and spiritually wounded. The crowds in Rome who shouted to the Tiber with Tiberius expressed more than just hatred for a dead tyrant. They were trying to purge their collective trauma, to wash away in the river's waters the contamination of 23 years of terror. But some stains are too deep for any river to cleanse. The Roman Empire would continue for centuries, achieving great heights and suffering terrible lows, but it never fully recovered from the wound Tiberius inflicted on its soul. In him, Rome saw what it could become at its worst, and that knowledge could never be unlearned. History judges Tiberius not just as a bad emperor, but as a fundamentally evil human being. While historians debate details and motivations, the essential verdict remains unchanged since ancient times. He is proof that power without conscience produces monsters, that human nature contains depths of depravity that shock even the most cynical observers. His name became synonymous with perversion in the ancient world, a shorthand for the worst excesses of tyranny. 2,000 years later, that association remains, a testament to the enduring power of evil to mark history. Yet perhaps the most important lesson of Tiberius is not about him, but about us. He was enabled by thousands who chose conformity over resistance, profit over principle, survival over virtue. Every guard who threw a child from the cliffs, every senator who condemned a colleague, every procurer who supplied victims. All were human beings who made choices. The evil of one man, no matter how powerful, could not have flourished without the cooperation of many. In that complicity lies both the horror and the warning. Evil on such a scale is never the work of a single monster, but of a monstrous system that ordinary people allow to function. As we close this dark chapter of human history, we are reminded that civilization is fragile, that the veneer of law and morality can crack under pressure. Tiberius represents what emerges when that veneer shatters completely. The beast lurking beneath the toga, the monster that power can make of man. His reign remains history's darkest warning about the price of unchecked authority and the depths of evil that reside in the human heart. May we never forget, lest we risk repeating the horrors of the past. The echoes of Tiberius's reign reverberated through centuries of Roman history and beyond. Every subsequent tyrant was measured against his standard of depravity. Every abuse of power evoked memories of Capri. The Roman people had learned that their emperors could be monsters, and that knowledge fundamentally changed the relationship between ruler and ruled. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, could never be fully restored. The Principate that Augustus had created as a solution to civil war proved capable of producing evils worse than any war. In the end, Tiberius's greatest crime may have been the poisoning of hope itself. He showed Rome that progress was not inevitable, that civilization could regress, that all the achievements of law and culture could not prevent a determined evil from flourishing. The senators who once debated the fate of nations were reduced to groveling courtiers. The soldiers who conquered the world became enablers of perversion. The law that had been Rome's gift to humanity became an instrument of oppression. In Tiberius, we see not just the failure of one man, but the vulnerability of all human institutions to corruption by evil. Yet even in this darkest of stories, we find cause for hope. Tiberius died. His evil, however powerful, was not immortal. The Roman Empire survived and would produce good emperors as well as bad. Human dignity, though brutalized, was not destroyed. Writers like Tacitus and Suetonius ensured that the truth would be remembered, that the victims would not be entirely forgotten. In the very act of recording these horrors, they performed an act of resistance, ensuring that future generations would know what had happened and could work to prevent its recurrence. Tiberius' story reminds us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against the darkness within ourselves and our societies. It shows us that power must be checked, that the law must bind all equally, that the vulnerable must be protected from the powerful. These lessons, written in the blood of Tiberius's victims, remain relevant in every age. As long as humans hold power over other humans, the potential for such evil exists. Our only defense is to remember to learn and to build systems strong enough to prevent monsters from turning their personal darkness into public policy. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting the same golden light that once illuminated Tiberius's crimes, we are left with the weight of history and the responsibility of memory. The tourists who flock to Capri for its beauty must also remember its horror. The students who study Roman history must understand that civilization's achievements rest on fragile foundations. The citizens of every nation must recognize that their freedoms depend on constant vigilance against those who would abuse power. Tiberius is dead, but the conditions that created him live on, waiting for new monsters to emerge unless we guard against them. In the final analysis, Tiberius remains history's sternest warning about humanity's capacity for evil. His reign demonstrates that depravity knows no bounds when power removes all restraints. But it also shows that evil, however powerful, ultimately fails. Tiberius died despised and alone. His name cursed, his memory vilified. The empire he corrupted outlasted him by centuries. The human spirit he tried to break ultimately endured. In that tension between human evil and human resilience lies both the horror and the hope of history. We must remember the horror to preserve the hope.